A view into the depths of society upon which this country has fallen. A storm brews upon the horizon. It's been said that those that have the eyes to see and the ears to hear will play a paramount role in the furthering of humanity and civilized society. But can civilized society and humanity survive the coming conflicts? Not seen since a dawn of time in ages bypast. But you can find true forms of information and knowledge in abundance at revolution.radio, freedomslips.com, the number one listener-supported radio station on the globe. Stand upon the right side of history.
General Homer, you've got to get us out of here now! I won't let you down. I won't let you down, son.
Revolution.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio. And now we return you to your host.
Well, for the second week in a row, we've got a major storm system that has led to deaths in the United States. I'm speaking primarily of Wynne, Arkansas, was hit with a devastating storm, horrific storm. People lost their lives. There's another storm system, much like this one that came through Friday, scheduled to hit this same Midwestern region Tuesday. So that would be on the 4th in 2 days. They're predicting a severe crop of weather in a couple of days in the same region. My heart goes out to the people in Arkansas. You know, it's unfortunate. It's that time of year. These things happen. It makes me think of an old man I worked with one time. I worked with him for years. He didn't talk a lot. He'd squint at you. He smoked these long cigarettes, and he'd be looking at you squinting, and he wouldn't say much. And he had a son that was a little closer to my age, and I rode my motorcycle over to this guy's house one day. And my buddy wasn't there, but his dad was there, squinting and smoking. And he said, "You better get that motor scooter home, son." And I said, why do you say that? He said, "Well, it's going to storm. It's going to storm like crazy here in about 20 minutes. And I looked at the sky and I said, "Well, what are you looking at, man?" I said, I don't see any rain coming." He says, "Oh yeah." He said, you look at them clouds, and the way those clouds are, about 20 minutes, storm like hell." And I went home, and about 20 minutes later, it stormed like hell. And I've worked out of doors most of my life, out in the elements, and I've worked around these guys that they can look and recognize things in the atmosphere, and they know what's coming. And I was watching the forecast Friday, and we were in that severe weather area, and the system came through. We didn't have the catastrophic weather that Arkansas experienced. And God bless you people in Arkansas. I saw some interviews with some of the folks down in Arkansas cleaning up and patching their wounds, and good hardy people, good middle of the country folk, just this good soul of the earth type folk down there. I think they're going to be fine. I think it's unfortunate, and I think it's just the nature of living. These things happen. All that being said, when you look at things like the war in Ukraine and the possible escalation coming betwixt ourselves and Russia, you know, to go from my own experience and my own knowledge, I come up lacking. I need to get information, glean information from people that have greater insight on these matters to derive an opinion. And you know, it's like going to school. It's like, why would you ever go to school? Well, to learn, to acquaint yourself with knowledge that you don't presently have. You rely on somebody who's versed in these things to educate you. And I was trying to put together in my head what could be valuable to talk about today. And there's a content creator, a presenter on YouTube I'm fond of. I think he does an excellent job. He's got over a million subscribers. He you know, he does well, and he's got good character. I take him to be an honest, upright guy. He's a Canadian prepper, and I'm sure some of you out there have heard of Canadian prepper. He does an excellent job. He really puts a lot of work into his YouTube channel, and his content, his presentation is top notch. As long as we've got these avenues of information, we should utilize them, because there's a lot of legislation out there these days to cramp down further on freedom of speech, and particularly on the internet. They want to regulate it further and further. I think the bill they're debating in the legislature right now, I think it's called the Restrict Act. The Restrict Act. And they want to restrict speech. They want to corral speech, because it's hard to sell a fiction. It's hard to sell a narrative when you've got competing narratives, when you've got alternative realities to present. They don't like competition, and that's really the gist of it. They just don't like competition. And so while we still can, I'd like to share the Canadian prepper and his interview with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. And Dr. Peter Vincent Pry was a highly accomplished nuclear arms expert. He had a couple of PhDs. He worked for the CIA. He worked for the Pentagon. He worked in our government. He was probably one of the foremost experts that really existed in these United States on nuclear war and all of its ramifications. He died just shy of a year ago. I want to say he died last August, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. And luckily, we have these interviews he did with Canadian prepper just prior to his death. Just in the 6 months prior to his death, he was able to do this series of interviews with the Canadian prepper, and it's insightful. It's very insightful because, again, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry was not a silly guy or a clown or somebody just shooting from the hip, doesn't really know much, just kind of winging it. Very learned guy, very sharp, not just a fella just guessing at things. He had a pretty good grasp on what's going on, and if we want to know what's going on, it's advisable to listen to people that have a higher degree of knowledge and knowing than we do. Unless you just, what do they call it, thick-headed, bullheaded. Oh, ain't nobody gonna tell me nothing. Well, okay, good luck with that. This guy, you got to respect somebody sometimes. Sometimes it's good to listen to what somebody else has to say, because they might be bringing you something valuable in the way of knowledge. So I'm going to begin my little presentation with kind of an ode to Dr. Peter Vincent Pry from the Canadian Prepper.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So this is not going to be an update video, guys, but I come bearing some unfortunate news for any of you who knew this individual. I was acquainted with this individual several times throughout the past 6 months. We did many interviews on the channel, and you can go and watch those videos in the description section before, and I would encourage you to do that because they are more relevant now than they've ever been before. Unfortunately, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry has lost his battle with cancer and has passed away. And this is very unfortunate for a variety of reasons, because he brought a perspective which was incredibly unique and rare, but well-informed, well-reasoned, and infallible, really, which withstood all scrutiny from many people who, were within the military, and, nobody could debunk this guy, okay? He had a wealth of knowledge about what was coming with respect to the war with Russia, and I'm going to try to break that down today for you. He also had some warnings, with respect to what might be coming next. And this not only highlights the fact that, yeah, life is short, we need to make sure that we're living it, because even Peter, as a prepper, as a person who understood the reasons to be prepared, and he understood the major threats that we face as a species, it just goes to show that, it's your time, right? So we must value, cherish, and immortalize these people who are willing to buck the trend, who go against the status quo, and who are making predictions and whose analysis of current events is at odds with what a lot of other people are saying, especially if their arguments withstand rigorous scrutiny, which his did. Now, I'm going to try to break down for you what his core ideas were, but I can in no way condense and do justice to all the information that was put across those 4 to 5 hours of interviews that we conducted with him over the past 6 months. And unfortunately, we're going to have another one not too far in the future here that was going to go into great depth about the Iranian bunker complexes, the North Korean situation and their military capabilities, and the China-Taiwan, how that would play out. All of this stuff, unfortunately, now we're never going to know. But thanks to the interview that I conducted with him, a lot of other channels like Valuetainment caught wind, picked him up, brought him on the channel. So he has been immortalized on the internet, which is good. At least we were able to get that knowledge out there. Now, the gist of what his warnings were that he cited a lot of historical examples, one of which was the Spanish Civil War. where he talked about how a guy named Adolf utilized this Spanish Civil War as a training ground for his troops, for his broader ambitions in Europe. And he tried to explain the current situation, the current quagmire, if you will, in Ukraine, with Russia's seemingly self-limiting and self-restricting military capabilities that they're bringing to bear there. You know, why is it that the Russians haven't brought but a substantial fraction of their military to bear to fight this conflict? They have not declared a general mobilization in spite of the fact that it's dragged on so much longer. Well, his theory was that perhaps the Russians are leveraging this as a training ground in order to get their troops battle hardened for the much broader conflict which could flare up in Eastern Europe after this one. So his theory, which is one that I had never heard before prior to him saying that, was that this is all being drawn out so that the Russians can prepare for an even greater war. Now, I have my criticisms of this idea. And I mean, we could probably debate it, and I could hear both sides and sympathize with both sides of that debate. However, he also had some other very non-conventional ideas when it came to non-conventional war, that is, nuclear war. You see, we are led to believe that this thing called mutually assured destruction is a deterrence to any country ever wanting to engage in nuclear conflict. He talked about how low-yield tactical nuclear weapons could very well be normalized within modern combat. He talked about how the Russians and the Chinese have a completely different set of nuclear doctrines and are actually training and designing their military around actually winning a nuclear war. But you see, we are led to believe by a lot of supposed experts that grace the stage of legacy media and these pseudoscientific studies about, you know, nuclear winter and nuclear fallout, which he also didn't believe was very likely nuclear winter, that is. We are told that nuclear war will never happen, and simply because of mutually assured destruction. But he completely breaks down and provides a wealth of evidence to suggest that not only do the Russians believe that nuclear war is winnable, but that in the current state of our military capabilities, that they would in fact win. And this is something that a lot of people took issue with at the time. However, I have not seen him be successfully debunked on almost any of his talking points. And in fact, a lot of that stuff has been corroborated by Lieutenant Colonel Jay Block was one of them, who didn't really disagree with a lot of what is said, what he said. However, he did say, I can't believe he's saying that, because a lot of that stuff, well, at least, you know, from his perspective, still being a military man, is considered classified information, right? Now, Peter had an extensive history working with various government agencies, one of which, of course, was the Central Intelligence Agency. And, you know, some people might hold that against him in terms of, you know, his speaking so openly about, you know, this kind of thing. But I think we need to just take what we can when people are willing to share these unconventional ideas and these unorthodox takes on the nature of war, and especially nuclear strategy, because what he's saying runs completely counter to everything else that we're being told. And he provides a good reason, and he was one of the reasons why I now actually am preparing, not like specifically night and day preparing for nuclear war to happen, but he was one of the people who convinced me that not only is it possible that a nuclear war will be fought, but that either side thinks they can win. And he laid it out to show me the feasibility of how that is exactly possible. And also, I think that his explanations of what Russia is doing right now were a lot more astute than a lot of the really dumbed down takes that were being spoon fed nonstop on the legacy media networks. Okay. So this guy was a one of a kind perspective. I would encourage you all to go and check out those series of videos that we did. I'm going to post the links in the description. I'm going to pin the top comment, and let's immortalize this guy on the internet so that people can't forget and people remember the perspective, because I do believe that his views will be validated someday, unfortunately, in some respects. And maybe, hopefully by that time, people have prepared. I just hope that, I think what he was trying to do is encourage people to prepare, because what we are being told about how this war could progress and how bad it could actually get was that it was being dumbed down. Okay. And we're not being told the whole truth. So, and I think this is also a reminder to all of us that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you know, and it doesn't matter how much you prepare. Some things you just can't prepare for. And life is incredibly short, and you should not waste it just constantly living in fear of the future. You should be out there enjoying your life. Me, as the Canadian prepper, obviously this is a job. Okay. And so if you were to do a job, that would be a big part of your life, but it doesn't have to be as big of a part of your life. It should only be a small proportion of your life. Very similar to, when you go and buy insurance, you pay for the insurance and that's it. With prepping, you can make the argument that self-reliance skills is also a way of life, and that it can be a very wholesome and fulfilling way of life. And so in that respect, it's not a bad thing. And I know a lot of people who, they prepare, but they don't live like the end of the world is coming, but they're as prepared as they're going to be for that eventuality. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that, and hopefully we can get those videos circulating again, because a lot of them have been completely, derailed by the algorithm. Unfortunately, some of them have 200,000-300,000 views. So we know that people are watching. We know that based on the watch time of those videos, people are very interested in what he's saying. They're watching all the way through. So I would encourage you, if you could, spread that information around, and stay tuned. I'll probably do another update video with respect to the goings on of the day. There is a lot of stuff to talk about, but I just wanted to do my acquaintance, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, justice. Rest in peace, brother. Thank you for the information that you shared with the world. Take care, guys. Canadian Prepper out.
So there you go, an ode to Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. And after the bottom of the hour, I'm going to start playing the first interview he did with Dr. Pry. And the guy is very insightful, very sharp. He knows his subject. He knows history. He's got a really good grasp on where we're at in regards to this present conflict with Russia. And if you want to know what's going on, if you want to understand the world around you, it's advisable to hearken to voices that can enlighten you. There's the Canadian prepper made reference to the fact that this guy isn't saying the same thing everybody else is saying. This guy has a very unique take, but it's from a wealth of experience. It's from just a vast treasure of knowledge that this guy speaks, not a vivid imagination. This guy is pulling from a reservoir of knowledge and expertise. That's what you're hearing when you listen to Dr. Pry address this situation. And that's why it's advisable to give credence to somebody like him, for the sake of knowing and understanding, because there is what they call the fog of war. where there's just sheer propaganda out there. And if you subject yourself to propaganda, you're not necessarily dwelling in the realm of truth. Propaganda can utilize truth, but propaganda generally serves to further an agenda. That's the purpose of propaganda, is to further an agenda. It's not reliant on truth necessarily. It's a propagation of this, that, or the other, not necessarily truthfulness. This guy was at the end of his life. He had no reason to lie. He was looking at eternity, and he was speaking from his heart and his mind with in an unreserved sense, trying to enlighten us as to the condition of things. And I hope those of you who stick with the program will hearken to Dr. Pry and what he's got to share with us today.
Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
This is Thomas, a.k.a. a Mad Painter. I'd like you to join me Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Open Canvas. Don't forget to bring an open mind.
Yes, folks, that's right. Bring an open mind to an open canvas. Again, that is Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern. UFOs to government corruption. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Are you interested in the paranormal, murder mystery, real natural law? Do you enjoy interviews with amazing guests? Then join Crypt Rick every Monday night, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on Revolution Radio. Studio A, freedomslips.com. Crypt Rick's High Thinking. Welcome to the Crypt.
Join me at Revolution Radio, Studio B, at 11 a.m. on Saturday for Free Association, when we take a look at philosophy, spirituality, psychology, social issues, and geopolitics. It's every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern on Studio B at freedomslips.com.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays, midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Apocalyptic Interstellar Council on Revolution Radio Studio A, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Join us as we traverse the starseed paradigm, as expressed in the time-space continuum that we know as the divine expression of love and light. Integrating this conscious unity into the galactic paradigm. So welcome all, both terrestrial beings and galactic beings as one. So be it. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. All right, thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
All right, and so without any further ado, I'd like to get to this interview with...
Russia is fighting the war in Ukraine with its fingers, not with its fists. What we're seeing on the ground is concocted, and it's fiction that is intended to deceive us. If Russia wanted to defeat the NATO alliance, it could do a nuclear EMP attack on NATO, and the resulting EMP field would black out electric grids from Ireland all the way to the edge of Ukraine. NATO would in effect be paralyzed by that one blow. Would the United States put itself at risk to save NATO Europe? Do the Russians really believe that we would do that? The Russians know that you can certainly win a nuclear war, and I think they're calling our bluff right now.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel we have a very special guest, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. He is Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, served as Chief of Staff of the Congressional EMP Commission. I've spoken about him and his work on this channel many times before, worked for the CIA and a variety of other places, I'm sure has a couple PhDs. And he's going to talk all about nuclear vulnerabilities on the NATO side of things, how a nuclear exchange between NATO and Russia might play out, maybe give some insights, whatever he can, on the current situation that's going on. And while we have people here, I know some people have a short attention span. So I think it's very important that you guys stick around for this talk, because Dr. Pry is going to talk about a fundamental belief that we as Westerners have, which is basically that our perception of nuclear weapons is one of nuclear deterrence. And most of us have been indoctrinated into the belief that a nuclear war is not only unwinnable, but unthinkable, okay? And that's because of something called mutually assured destruction, the idea that if we did start lobbing nukes back and forth, we, of course, would destroy ourselves. Now, Dr. Pry is going to challenge you on that in the sense that in the East, they don't possess this fundamental belief. They, in fact, view things quite differently. Where it's almost as cut and dry as we drive on the right side of the road, they drive on the left side of the road. In the East, they actually believe they can win a nuclear war, and they base their whole military strategy around that. So without further ado, I'm just going to let Dr. Pry talk all about that and everything else. So let us know what you think about this, Dr. Pry.
Sure. Well, the idea that a nuclear war is unwinnable is deeply embedded in our strategic culture and in the values of Judeo-Christian civilization, which believe in just war theory, not limiting collateral damage, to civilian populations. And because free societies that are based on democracies or republics, the most valuable thing in them, at least theoretically, is supposed to be the people. And so weapons of mass destruction that threaten the people it's almost inconceivable for such societies that place the highest value on human life as the idea that a nuclear war or use of weapons of mass destruction type war would be winnable, because you're destroying the thing that is most valued to you. But the strategic cultures of authoritarian and totalitarian states that don't place their highest value on the lives of the people, but place their highest values on, for example, in ideology, or place their and on the elites that run that society and who are the ideological spearheads of that society, whether it's a belief in the great Russian nationalism or a belief in communism, or a belief in the semi-divine status of Kim Jong-un of North Korea, or a belief in radical Islam. If that is your highest value and people are just a means to that end, then you can conceive of victory in a circumstance where you've lost millions of lives in a conflict if you achieve your political, geostrategic, ideological goals. You can see this, for example, in the Soviet victory in World War II, where they lost 30 million lives, not casualties, but 30 million dead. In fact, conquering the very area that they have invaded today in Ukraine. They're called the Bloodlands. The area from Ukraine into Eastern Europe, the Bloodlands, where 30 million Soviet soldiers died. And that's considered a great victory, even though it cost them 30 million lives. In the West, we have never made such sacrifice, lost such a large proportion of our population. America's, the United States loss in World War II was a few 100,000 people, nothing like 30 million people. And we probably wouldn't have considered it a victory if we had to pay such an awful cost. Now, this we have very different strategic cultures. You have to remember that, particularly here in North America. I think for Canadians and for in the United States both, we've had a long history where we've been isolated from the wars of Europe and Asia by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The only really big war that we've had here in the United States was the American Civil War, the bloodiest war we've ever fought. 750,000 people lost in that war. But for the most part, we've had a very good life here in North America. You know, our focus has been on economic prosperity, living the good life. We've gotten involved in wars overseas when we think we've had to, but we've never experienced the kind of mass destruction on our own territories that a country like Russia has, for example, that has a very different strategic culture than ours, that going back before modern times, you know, going back to the times of the Mongols and before that have been exposed to numerous invasions by other countries, have had mass destruction of their civilian population. Those that we know of, you know, beginning around 1000 AD or so, invasions by the Mongols, invasions by the Swedish Empire, invasions by Germany before it was in pre-modern times. There were Christian crusades launched out of Germany against part of Russia, invaded by Napoleon, invaded by Germany again in World War I, and then by Hitler. So their strategic culture is one where the expectation of what I would call a paranoid strategic culture. It's paranoid from our perspective, but from their perspective, given their history, it's not paranoid to think, wow, we're going to get invaded. That happens very frequently, and they've got to be prepared for a massive war that's going to be fought on their territory, and a total war that's aimed at the destruction of their people. That's a belief that's ingrained in Russian strategic culture in a way that it isn't ingrained in ours, where we're much more used to peace and to limited wars of limited objectives, where we're not out to wage genocidal wars against our adversaries. In fact, we'd like to reconstruct them and turn them into democracies if that's possible when we win a war. And as a consequence of our belief that a nuclear war is unwinnable because it would be such a destructive thing, we have postured our strategic forces. People think that the Russian nuclear posture and our nuclear posture are the same. They're not. They're as different as night and day. It's true that both sides have intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarines and strategic bombers, But that's about where the similarity ends. Our strategic posture is positioned for transparency and for avoiding nuclear war and deterring it. So most of our weapons are not on intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, which can be launched in minutes. We've even downloaded the warheads off of our ICBM, so every ICBM only carries a single warhead. This is a signal to Russia that we don't plan a first strike against them. Because if you were planning a first strike, you build up your ICBM force, you put multiple warheads on it so that one missile could take out many silos, many targets. But we don't do that. In fact, the ICBM force is the smallest part of our triad. We rely much more heavily on sub-launched ballistic missiles that are not equipped with intercontinental ballistic missiles. They have intermediate range missiles. So our submarines have to put to sea in order to attack Russia. And they can see when our submarines are in port. You know, we don't keep most of them at sea. Only about a third of them are out at sea to be survivable. The most of them are at port, and our adversaries can see that. So they can see we haven't mobilized our forces to launch a surprise attack against them. And the bombers, well, the bombers we have more warheads on them than we have on the ICBMs too, and it takes 3 days to mobilize our bomber force. So it's something that they would see us doing. We're not postured to make a surprise attack every day. The Russians are different. You know, they have never forgotten the many surprise attacks that they've suffered, including Operation Barbarossa, which was when Nazi Germany almost conquered the Soviet Union and almost destroyed it in a massive surprise attack. And their general staff says, we're never going to be surprised again. If there's ever another war, we're going to be the ones making the surprise attack. And they have postured their strategic forces to do that exactly. Most of their warheads are on intercontinental ballistic missiles that are ready to launch in a few minutes. Even their ballistic missile submarines carry intercontinental ballistic missiles, so they don't have to put to sea in order to attack us. They can launch right from port side and strike us, just like the land-based ICBM force. Even their ballistic missile submarines at sea, unlike us, you know, they usually don't send their submarines into the deep oceanic areas of the Pacific and the Atlantic. They're afraid that we would use our attack submarines to surprise them and attack their ballistic missile submarines. So they protect their submarines from surprise attack by keeping them in bastion areas, this White Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, which are heavily defended by their Navy. Now, underwater, they have cables across the bottom of these seas so that their submarines can clandestinely hook in to the General Staff Command and Control Network. So we can't even listen in if they're sending communications, unlocking codes, emergency action messages. They can get all of that secretly by these cables, just like all the other missile forces of Russia. They can raise the mobilization of their forces secretly. We won't see it, and then they could launch their surprise attack. The only part of the Russian strategic forces that's highly visible for us is their bomber force. You know, the bombers, just because of the nature of bombers, they've got to be fueled up. They have to have pilots. You've got to upload the nuclear weapons. That's a very highly visible thing. But they have practiced and have exercised not mobilizing the bomber force so that we would see, oh, the bomber force isn't mobilized. That's a clue that they're not getting ready for a surprise attack. And they would hope that we would misinterpret, you know, the non-mobilization of bombers so that we would not raise our posture. And in effect, that's exactly where we are today. This so far has sounded like a theoretical discussion. But a couple of Sundays ago, on February 27th, dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, declared a special combat alert for his strategic nuclear forces. And he went down into one of the hundreds of deep underground command and control shelters. These are huge underground facilities buried under hundreds of meters of solid granite that can accommodate, each one of them can accommodate like 30,000 Russian military and political elites. They're impervious to nuclear attack by us. It's one of the evidences that they believe you can fight and win a nuclear war, because their elites at least can survive it. But they also have massive civil defense capabilities for their civilian population too. For example, all the subways, the huge subway system in Moscow has nuclear blast doors on it. None of our subways have something like that, so that you can get the population of Moscow down into the subways, close the doors, and they would have a much better chance of surviving a nuclear attack than we would if something like that were to happen. But the last thing any adversary, whether it's the Russians or the United States, is going to attack is the cities anyway. You know, because the objective of a nuclear war, if you want to win it, is to disarm your adversary, to destroy his bombers, his ICBMs, his submarines in port. That's what their first strike plan would be about. And then you can hold the cities hostage and say, surrender now, or we're going to start taking out your cities one by one. That's been the Russian plan. They have never agreed with the idea of mutual assured destruction. They have encouraged us to believe in mutual assured destruction so that we will not copy their plan, a war-winning plan. They want us to just focus on nuclear deterrence. And let us hope that it is not too late, okay? Because the Biden administration has been unwilling to admit that Russia has really gone to an increased readiness level with its nuclear forces. And I think that's being done for political reasons. They don't want to compound their humiliation in Afghanistan with an even worse humiliation and have to explain to the American people, why has Ukraine policy, what's so important about Ukraine to the West that we are willing to go to the verge of a nuclear war with Russia about it? And I'm not just blaming Biden here. The chicken hawks in the Republican Party are all for jumping into Ukraine and getting us involved in a war in Ukraine. And that's because they're being encouraged, by almost all of our information about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is coming from the Ukrainian government, which wants us to jump in and get involved in the war and help Ukrainians win. And it's also coming from the Biden administration, because the Biden administration President Biden doesn't want the conversation to be about his throwing away of 50 years of American credibility. Our security guarantees to our allies are all based on our credibility, and that credibility is a precious thing. But he put it all on the line in Ukraine by drawing a line in the sand and saying, Russia, don't cross that line. And Putin went across that line with tanks. Biden and his people in the White House don't want the conversation to be about that. So they have an interest too in convincing us, well, he crossed the line, but the Russians aren't winning. They're doing very badly in Ukraine. They're bogged down. They're losing the war. But this encourages people who want to involve us in the war, to jump into the war. And I think that would be a grave mistake, because I don't think we can trust what we're being told about the status of the war. The fog of war is very thick, especially when all of the intelligence is coming from two biased sources, the Ukrainian government and the Biden White House. The last thing they want to admit is that the Russians are getting what they want in Ukraine. We are probably making a very serious error in assuming that the Russians are losing. It could be that what we're hearing every night on television is true. Maybe that's true. But I would remind you that it was less than a year ago that in Afghanistan, we thought it was true that we could withdraw from Afghanistan and have an Afghan government that was sympathetic to the West and that they would not immediately fall, and that we basically wouldn't have to withdraw in a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Taliban. Our Department of Defense and our Joint Chiefs, led by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this was our most important thing. The credibility of the Biden administration depended upon it, but they couldn't even defeat the Taliban. In the end, we did suffer a humiliating defeat by them. We should be mindful before we get involved in a war over Ukraine to remember that our nuclear deterrent is not modern the way Russia's is, that it's 30 years old. All the delivery systems were built under the Reagan administration. The nuclear weapons themselves are more than 30 years old. They've not been tested in 30 years. We've been patching them up and hoping that they'll work. A lot of our own nuclear weapon scientists who designed those weapons have been warning that you can't monkey around with a nuclear weapon design like that and have high confidence that it's going to work. Not only has Russia got modern delivery systems and modern nuclear weapons, it has super weapons that have no counterpart in the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Weapons designed to make what are called super EMP attacks. This is an electromagnetic field that could theoretically win a nuclear war with a single blow by frying the electronics in our forces as well as in our civilian society, electric grids. Weapons that just generate X-rays so that their anti-missile systems will work. And by the way, that's another sign of the Russian belief that they can fight and win a nuclear war. They've got 10,000 anti-ballistic and anti-aircraft missiles, 10,000 of them. And they are dual capable. They can carry conventional or nuclear weapons. We have fewer than 100 anti-missile systems in our national missile defense, and they're not even capable of we have grave questions of how effective they would be against the North Korean missile threat, because the North Korean missiles are based on Chinese and Russian technology, which is a lot more advanced than what we thought the North Koreans would end up with. The Russians also have a unilateral advantage in biological and chemical weapons because they've cheated on both of those treaties, just as they've cheated on the Tactical Nuclear Weapons Treaty, the Presidential Nuclear Initiative, and they have at least a 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons. I'm going to propose to you, and I'm not saying this is the ground truth in Ukraine, but I'm going to propose to you an alternative reality, something you're not going to hear from anybody else, I'm pretty sure, that is not, there's a different way of interpreting the facts on the ground in Ukraine. And it's the Austerlitz scenario. We're all convinced, and guys like Senator Graham want us to jump in and get involved in the war because the Ukrainians are telling us that they're killing Russians at the rate of 10-to-1, and the Russians, are on the verge of defeat. And if we only come in and help them, that we can quickly defeat the Russians. That's what everybody thinks with 100% certainty is the truth on the ground. And I say the fog of war is so thick and the circumstances such that we can't trust that. Maybe it's true, but I don't know it's true. This could be an alternative. Maybe this is all being done deliberately by the Russians, and they want us to think that they're bogged down, and they want us to think that they're losing the battle because they want us to jump into the Ukrainian war and crush us with that 10-to-1 advantage in tactical nuclear weapons, the advantage in biological and chemical weapons, their advantage in cyber weapons, and just crush us and permanently solve the problem of NATO and the United States. It might be more about taking over Ukraine. It might be more than taking over Ukraine in terms of the Russian objective. Maybe what they want to do is just change the world order by becoming the top dog in that world order. How is the Battle of Austerlitz relevant to this? Well, the Russian general staff are great students of military history. Austerlitz was Napoleon's greatest victory in 1805. And they make particular study of that one because the victory was over Russia itself. The combined armies, the greatest powers of Europe, of the mainland Europe were involved in that battle. Russia, Austria, and Prussia were all allied together on one side against Napoleon, against the French army. And Napoleon, where it was fought, it was closer to Russia. So he was, Napoleon wanted to create the impression that he was going to lose this battle. He sent intelligence to the Russians and Austrians that he was overextended, that he had supply problems, that he didn't have enough men. He deliberately occupied the worst part of the battlefield. He had troops defect to the Russians and Austrians to tell them, we're beaten. We're not going to lose this war. He actually had whole regiments of French troops retreat from the Russians. All of this was to lure them into attacking and have battle there on what had been Napoleon's chosen ground, so that he could then unleash a number of corps that he could see concealed from view, and he crushed the combined forces of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and it gave Napoleon dominance over Europe for the next decade. So these crowned heads of Europe, while he didn't take over their countries, they were basically bootlickers to Napoleon and had to do whatever he said until Napoleon made the fatal decision to invade Russia and stayed too long. But it could be, I submit, and I'm not saying that this is the scenario that's happening. It could be that Russians are bogged down and they're losing. But I think we have to be more imaginative and think about, well, what are other scenarios that may be possible? Is it possible that they actually want us to intervene? It's hard to resist the conclusion that a lot of the things the Russians are doing are deliberately intended to provoke us. There are a few things that are harder for the Western democracies to resist than intervening against a cruel dictator, an inhuman dictator who seems to be militarily weak, and so it will be easy to defeat him. And that seems to be an impression that Putin, maybe it's true that he is that, but it's certainly an impression he's doing nothing to discourage and by his day-to-day behavior. There's another scenario about Ukraine that we ought to keep in mind. Everybody has assumed going into this, and I have to admit, even myself, that if the Russians invaded Ukraine, they would want a quick victory. Because here I forgot about my own lesson about mirror imaging, about, that we ought not to assume that our enemies think the way we do and would wage war the way the West would. We always want a quick victory. We want the killing and the battles to be over as soon as possible, and to capture the territory as soon as possible. And we had a reason to think that Russia might do that in Ukraine because of the way they took over Crimea. You know, they did it in lightning speed, very little bloodshed, and it was a great victory for them. But there was another scenario going on right under our noses that we appear to have ignored. And that's what's happened to Luhansk and the battle, the long war, the long siege war that's been going on in eastern Ukraine. That's been going on for 8 years. The Russians at any time could have ended that war. They could have decisively taken over that area, but they haven't. They deliberately wanted to have a protracted war in that area. Maybe what Putin wants is to permanently have a long war going on in Ukraine as long as he can do it. Something we need to remember is their second most important industry is armaments. When the world thinks it's always on the verge of World War III, people are much more interested in buying arms. And so that's going to help the Russian arms industry. Here's another scenario. And several of these scenarios, by the way, can be simultaneously true. Another scenario is the Spanish Civil War. Before Nazi Germany launched World War II, they wanted to make sure that their new weapons and tactics, the Blitzkrieg.
Looks like we're headed into a break. If you're still with me, I appreciate that. And we'll continue the interview after the break.
Listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
You going back in? There's still men out there. God damn. When I go home, people ask me, hey, Hoot, why do you do it, man? Why? You some kind of war junkie? I won't say a goddamn word. Why? They won't understand. They won't understand why we do it. They won't understand it's about the men next to you. And that's it. That's all it is.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, #1 listener-supported radio, the printing press for freedom at a time when freedom is needed the most.
I am Bill Johnson. Some consider my efforts to be an underground law school. I am not an attorney, and I do not give legal advice. I teach. That's lawful and legal. Consider yourself served. You are to appear Wednesday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern, Studio A. My forte? Foreclosure and contract law. Grab your legal pad and pen. Learn a broad spectrum of law spanning administrative, criminal, family, tort, and federal law. Fools and losers cling to old cases. I dissect and comment on the latest rulings that control the courts. Don't be a loser. And if you don't appear, you will be held in contempt.
I will defend myself against their tyranny. Number 3 is my radio broadcast. I'm squarely in front of the public all the time, and they all know what's going on.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on the means for expanding its sphere of influence.
Hello, my name is John Wayne, and I do a broadcast here at freedomslips.com, revolution.radio, called The Unequivocal Truth, DEFCON 1.
Freedom and fear
are at war.
And folks, I assure you, we are in Defense Condition 1, as we journey perilously through this paradigm that we currently reside in. And I ask that you join me every Saturday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the unequivocal truth. DEFCON 1.
We shall never surrender.
The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite, surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing, in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with a panametric fan. The lineup consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes, so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the normal Lotus-O deltoid type, placed in panendermic semi-boloid slots of the stator, every 7th conductor being connected by a non-reversible Tremi pipe to the differential girdle spring on the up end of the gram meters.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio, taking the confusion out of transmutated lunar girdle springs for 4 years and running. Revolution Radio, the #1 listener-supported alternative media radio on the planet. All right, thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
Well, thank you so much for listening. And I don't know if I remembered in the first hour, but if you have the means, please consider helping us maintain this platform, this free speech platform. freedomslips.org, freedomslips.net, revolution.radio. All that takes you to the homepage, and there's a donate button you can click on there, and it doesn't have to be a lot of money. Anything helps to keep this going, because there is a cost related to being able to present this information, and it's, you know, it's on borrowed time as it is. They're gonna regulate speech more and more. It's just the way it is. But while we can still speak freely, there is a cost, and if you have the means, if you have the capacity, if you have it in your heart to help keep us going, revolution.radio, and there's a button at the top of the page. Click there for all the avenues of ways that you may be able to help. So if I may, I'd like to get back to this interview with Dr. Peter Pry, an expert in his field on nuclear war.
That enabled them to almost win World War II. They wanted to make sure it would work. And they wanted to have veteran soldiers who had combat experience. And so they used the Spanish Civil War to give combat experience to many of their soldiers and to test out their new weapons and tactics. I think it's no accident that Russia is using some of its advanced weapons, like the hypersonic Iskander has been launched. I'm pretty sure that they didn't do that just to destroy a building. You know, I think the reason they're doing that is to test out their new weapon systems, to give experience to their troops in launching these systems, to give experience to their ground troops and to their general staffs. And, well, here's how you actually fight a real war. You know, a veteran soldier who's got combat experience, who's been blooded, is worth 2 or 3 soldiers who are green and who have never been exposed to combat. And I think that that's one of the things Putin wants out of this war, whether he's losing or not. He's going to value very highly the experience that his general staff and that his ground troops have gotten out of Ukraine. So these are all alternative theories to the one that is the only one that we're hearing on television every day. The one that has the happy face on it for us is that, oh, the Russians are on the verge of defeat and we can jump in there and help the Ukrainians achieve a quick victory. Please be aware. There are at least several alternative theories that suggest that if we do that, we're going to be handed another Afghanistan, another Iraq, another Syria, another Libya, another military disaster, except this one won't be a small one. This one would be, it could destroy NATO, and it could destroy the United States, and it could change the balance of power in the world if we're wrong about this assessment that we're hearing every day on television.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that theory, because I've heard that, and I don't know if this is true, like you say, the fog of war, but that a lot of the newer weapon systems aren't actually being used in Ukraine yet, like the newer jets, like the I think it's the Su-35, or is it the 42, one of their most advanced fighter jets. A lot of their Air Force hasn't been deployed. They're only, as of recent, using hypersonic weapons. And it does appear like a lot of that is, like you say, a potential testing ground for these things. So your first theory that you propose of them trying to bait NATO into a fight and appearing weak when they're in fact strong would make a lot of sense, in light of that, because we're not seeing a lot of their more advanced weaponry that they could bring to bear being used. At least we're not seeing it.
Sure, and to expand upon the points that you and I have both made, Russia only mobilized 200,000 troops to invade Ukraine. They have an army, a standing army of 1 million men. Only 75% of that 200,000 has actually gone into Ukraine. They have 2,000 aircraft in their Air Force, and they haven't unleashed the Air Force really. Ukraine has got 70 modern aircraft. All these air victories that they're achieving are with 70 aircraft. The Armata, their new Armata tank hasn't been sent in. Their older model tanks they've sent in to fight you. They've got 20,000 tanks, by the way. And only Russia is fighting the war in Ukraine with its fingers, not with its fists. It has vast conventional military potential that has not been unleashed in Ukraine. And on these things too make me suspicious that what we're seeing on the ground is concocted, and it's a fiction that is intended to deceive us and maybe lure us into the war. I could be wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope the Ukrainians are really doing as well as they're telling us they're doing. But even if they are, Russia is a nuclear superpower. And if we were to intervene, it's a virtual certainty it would escalate, and we would be the losers in that. They're postured to win a nuclear war right now, and we're very close to the edge right now, I think. The possibilities of miscalculation are even more worrisome to me than what Russian designs may be. World War I started through a single bullet fired into the chest of an Austrian archduke. And through a series of miscalculations by the great powers, that rapidly escalated into World War I. And in just a few years, there were 40 million casualties, all because of miscalculation by the various sides, who, by mobilizing their forces and the rest, thought the others would stand down. Nobody intended for the war to happen, but it did. Nobody intends for a nuclear war to happen, or a cyber or an EMP war to happen out of this thing. Or maybe the Russians do intend it to happen. On our side, nobody wants that to happen, but the possibility of it happening through accident, through miscalculation, when the superpowers confront each other, is extremely high. And Ukraine, in terms of its strategic importance, is far more important than little Serbia was during World War I. We need to stay out of this thing. My heart goes out to the Ukrainians, but the lesson we need to draw is Ukraine is what happens when the United States allows its military and nuclear capabilities to become hollowed out and obsolete. The other side sees that, and then that tempts them into aggression. And we're going to see more acts of aggression unless the best way to avenge Ukraine is to remember the lessons of Ronald Reagan and the strategy of peace through strength. We need to make ourselves so strong again in our economy, in our conventional weapons, and in our nuclear weapons that no one will challenge us, that they will be afraid to go and invade Ukraine because they'll be concerned about what the big dog, America, will do.
So I wanted to ask you, you talked briefly about the super EMP weapons, and this is something which has been a bit elusive for me in terms of understanding the mechanics of how that would actually work. I've heard you talk before about weapons that could be deployed that are very similar in their effect of EMP weapons minus the radioactive fallout and stuff like that. Could you maybe just talk a bit more about those types of that type of equipment and how it might actually be used in Europe if push came to shove?
Sure. One scenario that the EMP Commission looked at. I was definitely involved in the analysis, and it's in one of my EMP Commission reports. But we were concerned about a scenario that could happen now over the crisis in Ukraine, that if Russia wanted to defeat the NATO alliance, it could do a nuclear EMP attack on NATO by detonating a nuclear weapon, a super EMP weapon, at high altitude, 70 kilometers high, that's outside the atmosphere, over NATO headquarters in Brussels. And the resulting EMP field would black out electric grids from Ireland, United Kingdom, France, all the way to the edge of Ukraine. The whole NATO alliance would be blacked out. And when you blacked out the electric grids, all the other critical infrastructures failed too. There'd be no water, food would start spoiling, no telecommunications, transportation systems wouldn't work. None of the things would work that you need to mobilize your forces to defend yourselves. NATO would in effect be paralyzed by that one blow. It would be a red carpet for those 20,000 Russian tanks to reach the English Channel virtually unopposed. So that's how a nuclear EMP works, or in terms of the strategic application of a nuclear EMP attack. How does it work in terms of the physics? An EMP attack, an EMP is like a super energetic radio wave, and it's got so much energy in it that it'll fry electronics. So the electronics will be destroyed across the area that the EMP field is exposing. And in this case that I just described, the EMP field would reach from eastern Poland all the way to Ireland with an EMP attack like that. You could do an EMP attack over North America that would do the same thing. At an altitude of 300 kilometers, the field would cover most of Canada, all 48 contiguous United States, and a good chunk of Mexico. And not only would our civilian unprotected systems be destroyed by the super EMP, but our military systems as well, because they're not hardened that high. During the Cold War, we only hardened them to 50,000 volts per meter, which is a very high level. I mean, imagine that, 50,000 volts per meter, but a super EMP weapon can make 100,000 or 200,000 volts per meter. Imagine if you had most of the things in our electronic society operate on 120 volts or less. Imagine if you had a plug in your house that could generate 100,000 volts. I mean, what do you think would happen if you plugged anything into that outlet? Obviously, it would be destroyed. And so, in effect, that's what you're doing when you put an EMP field down over a whole continent. Everything that's got electronics. Not everything would be destroyed necessarily. A lot of things, even most things, might survive, but so much would be destroyed that it would all come grinding to a halt. It doesn't take much to stop an electronic civilization and to kill it. It's like the body. You don't have to destroy every organ in the body to kill a person. If you destroy enough, a few percentage, but much stuff would be destroyed. Probably be much more than a few percentage than by a super EMP weapon. So automobiles stop, airplanes fall out of the sky, that sort of thing.
So don't you think, though, that if they were to deploy such a weapon, and I guess this is where I'd like to get more insight about the non-nuclear EMP weapons, because don't you think if they were to deploy such a thing, that would basically bring the full force of NATO into the war, like with the U.S. in terms of their nuclear arsenal? Like, wouldn't that prompt a nuclear response from the U.S.?
Well, our nuclear weapons have to work. Even the nuclear weapons, the electronics in the delivery systems, the bombers, the ICBMs, the ballistic missile submarines, these are vastly complicated electronic machines. And they're only hardened to 50,000 volts per meter. Their electronics are going to be vulnerable too. And we might not even know who attacked us. The first thing that gets taken out by an EMP are the satellites and the ballistic missile early warning radars. The EMP travels at the speed of light. In order for us to know who attacked us, those things have to survive. And then you have to have the retaliatory capability. The whole point of doing an EMP would be to deny your adversary his retaliatory capability by destroying it.
And I had Dr. Arthur Bradley on here, and we talked about your paper that you had written about the potential use for an EMP weapon in Europe. And he said that one of the things that he wasn't quite in agreement with was he thought that would immediately prompt a nuclear response to the United States. So you don't think so? Like, obviously on continental Europe, those systems might be fried, potentially, the ones that aren't hardened. But what about, like, what would the U.S. response to that be? Like, would they start launching nukes at Moscow, or would there be like some deniability there? Like, because I think he even said that they would be able to see right when the nuke went up into space. Is that true, or?
Well, the United States would be able to see when the single missile went up into space.
I
Maybe
guess
not.
either them or their command and control in Europe would be able to see that if they launched this EMP weapon, like right when they launched it, that we would detect it.
Europe doesn't have the large phased array ballistic missile early warning radars that we do, and they're not aimed over the continent of Europe. What we would pick up, we might pick up, if they decided to do it with an intermediate range ballistic missile, we might pick up the launch of that single missile, but a lot of missiles are being launched from Russia. And how would we know that missile isn't intended to, armed with a conventional warhead? Or even if it's armed with a nuclear warhead, how do we know it's not going to go to the ground to attack an airbase or something like that? Our satellites and the North American air defense array is oriented for missiles coming over the North Pole to attack the United States, not chiefly Europe. And you can do it clandestinely. You could launch a satellite and say this is a space launch vehicle. And in fact, the Russians had a secret weapon called the fractional orbital bombardment system. China has it too now. They basically experimented with this. You could pretend that you're launching a space satellite for peaceful communications purposes, but you've got a super EMP warhead inside it. North Korea's got 2 satellites orbiting over North Korea as we speak, the KMS-3 and KMS-4. They declared are peaceful satellites, but the EMP Commission has warned that these things could be armed with super EMP warheads, and they might be orbiting us so that in an emergency, North Korea could detonate them, when they need to do an EMP attack. There's all kinds of ways of you could launch the EMP out of a attack submarine, a cruise missile that goes to high altitude. They've got such missiles. One of them they market internationally. It's called the Club K, and it flies at subsonic speeds for a long period of time, close to the water. But then at the last minute, it can go up to high altitude, high enough to do an EMP attack at supersonic speeds. So they have many platforms, many different ways of doing it that don't involve ICBMs, that would be detectable by radar, ballistic missiles by us. And that is the question that your friend has said, and that is the usual answer. That's what a lot of people have an inherent faith in is, well, surely if Russia made a nuclear attack on European NATO, the United States is going to respond, and that's what's going to deter it. That has been the whole basis of the belief of mutual assured destruction. That's what we've been gambling on. And that's why the United States needs to modernize and build up its strategic forces so that we are credible about that. It doesn't help deterrence when President Biden meets in Geneva with Putin and says a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That reassures the Russians and Chinese and North Koreans that that's what we believe, okay? But they need to be convinced that we are willing to use nuclear weapons to come to the defense of our friends. That's a huge assumption. Would the United States put itself at risk, to save NATO Europe? That's the promise. That's what everybody assumes. But when it really comes down to it, do the Russians really believe that we would do that? I don't think they're impressed with our behavior in Ukraine. I mean, maybe that's why Lindsey Graham and others want us to go in. Right now, American policy in Ukraine is to fight to the death of the last brave Ukrainian and apply economic sanctions against Russia as if that's really doing something. How many times have we applied economic sanctions and they've done nothing? We've done it against Iran, against North Korea, against China. Economic sanctions don't seem to accomplish anything. When economic sanctions really work, they can actually provoke a war. That's why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, because FDR wanted them to stop attacking China. And so he imposed an oil sanction on Japan. And they had to make a choice. Do we surrender to the economic sanctions from the degenerate Americans who are not willing to fight us? Or do we launch Pearl Harbor and take over, establish our Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere, invading the Philippines, invading Southeast Asia? and achieve our dream of a Japanese Pacific Empire. They chose most military dictatorships only respect military strength. And that's what the Japanese did. So, what we're doing here in Ukraine isn't building up our credibility that we're willing to take existential risks in order to save our friends.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point that I don't think a lot of, and it goes back to that fundamental belief about mutually assured destruction, is we take for granted this notion that, we're suddenly going to jump in, and just because Russia uses a nuke over there, that we're suddenly going to jump in and be the saviors and put our own existence at risk. But, perhaps our military generals, aren't going to play that game, and maybe Russia knows it, and they're going to call the bluff, as you say.
Exactly. I think they're calling the bluff now. And that's why they invaded Ukraine, because they don't believe it anymore. They don't believe that we are credible when it comes to our nuclear security guarantees. Why should they? When we have allowed our nuclear triad to become obsolete, and when we have nuclear weapons that have been untested in 30 years. Congress accepts every year, the national laboratories every year, they get certified. The nuclear weapons still work, even though we haven't tested them, and even though we're patching them together. But the Russians and Chinese believe that. They've been testing their nuclear weapons. The State Department admitted last year that they've been violating the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty for 30 years, and they've been doing low-yield tests of their nuclear weapons, so they can have confidence their nuclear inventory is going to work. Everything out of our mouths and everything we do would lead our adversaries to think that we don't take nuclear deterrence seriously anymore. And I think they're calling our bluff right now. I'm almost reluctant to say this because this is a Canadian audience, all right?
We're mostly actually an American audience, believe it or not.
Okay, but as an advocate of national interest, of America first and a national interest, if I were advising a president and Russia started a nuclear war in NATO, I'd say, I don't think I would advise the president to put America at risk to save the NATO member states who have basically not done their job to maintain their militaries at a sufficient level of strength to deter the Russians. That's been a long complaint from us. I mean, they have allowed their military strength to so deteriorate that they've become tempting. I mean, I think one of the other reasons Russia has been willing to invade Ukraine is that they know NATO is militarily hollow. I mean, do you know that, there was a time during the Cold War when Germany, had a couple of thousand main battle tanks. Germany has 250 main battle tanks today, but we had 5,000 main battle tanks in Germany during the Cold War. Obama took them all out. There were 0 main battle tanks, US main battle tanks in Europe under Obama. Trump started putting some back in, but we only have 100 main battle tanks in Germany today. One of the reasons the Ukrainians are doing so well is the Ukraine has as many main battle tanks as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the Benelux countries combined. That's one of the reasons they may be doing so well against the Russians, because they've got many more main battle tanks than European NATO has. The other part of the equation, going back to the scenarios, if Ukraine is achieving victory over the Russians, and that happens to be true, does that, even if it's true, does that mean it should jump into it? Let's not forget, by the Russians fighting the Ukrainian army, they're in effect fighting the Russian army. The Ukrainian general staff and their troops were trained by the Russians. They're using Russian military equipment. The Ukrainians know how the Russian general staff thinks. That may be another reason why, if they're doing well, they're doing well. Why would we assume that we would find the same fortune, assuming the Ukrainians are meeting with good fortune? We haven't tested our stuff against Russian plans, Russian equipment, the Russian way of warfare. We might be very surprised to discover that our hollowed out militaries, the European NATO, don't do well on the Ukrainian battlefield. And we can't even do it, by the way. NATO has never exercised projecting large numbers of general purpose forces into Eastern Europe. The defense of Western European NATO at the height of the Cold War was always defensive. The Russians were supposed to attack, and we were supposed to hold them off. And we thought we would have to resort to tactical nuclear weapons in order to hold them off. This idea that we're going to project power into Eastern Europe and defeat the Russians sounds very Napoleonic to me. I don't mean 1805 Napoleonic. I mean 1812 Napoleonic, when he led the French army, the Grand Army, into Russia, and it ended up getting destroyed by General Winter and by the Russian army. But to go back to your friend, I mean, it's all, again, it all depends on credibility. And, you know, he speaks with such great certainty that yes, the United States would do that. I don't know that that's clear at all. We hope, or at least our European allies hope, the United States would do that. Japan hopes that we will come to their rescue. Our other partners in the Pacific hopes that we would use our nuclear weapons to defend them, to deter the nuclear umbrella. But the nuclear umbrella is old and tattered and tired, and even and at least this current political leadership seems to believe in it so little that that in Geneva last summer he said a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, forgetting that the United States has won a nuclear war. You know, we won World War II. That was a nuclear war. The Russians know that you can certainly win a nuclear war against any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, and that's most of the world. You know, but we seem to have forgotten that lesson. The assumption that a nuclear war can't be won is based all on this hope, or this premise that the United States will be there for our allies and be willing to put our own homeland at risk, even if they attack Latvia, you know, with a nuclear weapon. Most Americans can't even find Latvia.
Looks like the break's coming up. If you're still with me, thank you so much.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Ladies and gentlemen, your lives are becoming more difficult as the life force of your world is draining away. Have you noticed that as everything around you seems to decline, one thing still grows? It is the power of your rulers. None of their plans and directives have solved your problems or made your life better. The only result has been their increased control over you at the cost of your freedom. Do you know why? You gave them the power. They called for your sacrifice, and you thought it was noble. They said if you worked for yourself and your family, that you were selfish and uncaring, and they made you feel ashamed. They denounced the leaders of industry as greedy exploiters. You agreed. All evil needs to win is the consent of good people. To everyone within the range of my voice, you now have a choice to make. If you decide to support the notion of sacrifice enforced by the state, your game is up. Your world is in a downward spiral, and you will ride it down to destruction. But if you share the values, if you believe that your life is a sacred possession for you to make the most of, if you want to live by the judgment of your own mind, not edicts from the state, then follow our lead. Do not support your own oppressors. Stop letting the system exploit you. Form your own communities on the frontiers of your crumbling world. Your rulers hold you by your endurance to carry the burdens they impose, by your generosity when you hear cries of despair, and above all, by your innocence which cannot grasp the depths of their evil. The world you are living in is the world they wanted. Leave them to it. Those who are eager to build a better world, a world of freedom and opportunity, a world based on mutual respect. In that world, you will not receive alms, nor pity, nor forgiveness of sins, but honor, respect, and justice. Don't let the fire go out spark by irreplaceable spark in confusion and despair. The world you desire can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It is yours.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. The #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. It's your world. Take it. Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio! Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Well, if you're still with me, I really appreciate it. I really do. And we've been listening to an interview between the Canadian prepper, who's a YouTuber. He's got over 1 million subscribers on his YouTube channel. He does an excellent job. He researches like crazy. He brings very credible information. He's very on top of his credibility. He doesn't want to give bad information, so he researches what he delivers in depth before he says anything. He tries to make sure it's absolutely validated before he gives you any information. He's very credible, and this is an interview he did a year ago. This interview goes back a year with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, one of the foremost nuclear war experts that the United States had. Now, Dr. Peter Pry has passed away. He died, I believe, last August. So he's no longer with us. But these interviews I believe, are invaluable with his insight, his expertise, his knowledge on these matters relating to nuclear war and all the different scenarios and possibilities therein. And I think it's very important that we acquaint ourselves with an expert's opinion, what we're facing today in regards to war with Russia. So without further ado, I'm going to continue with this interview. Thank you.
And Latvia on a map. Someone once said, never promise to go to nuclear war for a country you can't find on a map. You know, we could have a whole other conversation about whether we should have expanded NATO in the first place. I don't think we should have, because it created this very situation. When I was a young man, I was on the House Armed Services Committee, and I had the NATO portfolio. And one of my jobs was to go to these East European countries that were former Warsaw Pact countries and come back and advise Congress on whether we should expand NATO to the East or not. And I said we shouldn't. You know, these countries are really not capable of defending themselves. Their economies are weak. They're going to be dependent. We can't defend them. We can't project power. The only way we can defend them is with our nuclear deterrent. So we are going to basically be making giving a promissory note to countries like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, all these former Warsaw Pact member states, a promissory note that we're going to go to nuclear war to defend their sovereignty. As a footnote to the Ukraine war, by the way, One of the main reasons Russia has invaded Ukraine is because it believed that Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO. And that even if we didn't officially make Ukraine a member of NATO, that it had in effect was becoming a de facto member of NATO. Aren't we behaving exactly as if that's true? And isn't our behavior and this warmongering that's going on playing right in to the paranoid views of the Russian general staff and a lot of the Russian people that, look, Putin was right. We were planning to make Ukraine a member of NATO, and we're behaving just as if they're really a member of NATO. You know, my heart bleeds for the Ukrainians, but the survival of our own nations come first. You know, the lesson we need to draw from this is that we can't afford to be militarily weak anymore. We've got to rebuild our strength. Had we maintained that military strength and pursued the peace through strength strategy, maybe Russia would have remained contained and Ukraine not become a victim.
And I have this fascinating stuff. I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day, but I just have a couple specific questions. One is with respect to the ICBMs and the submarines. I had a couple commenters on a recent video say that there is ICBMs on the submarines. I just want to know if you can maybe comment a bit about that. Can you just explain in more detail what the capabilities of the submarines is? Because for everybody, for most people, that's the big one of the triad, and that's our primary tools in the arsenal. Now, if you're saying that that is limited in its capability, and maybe you could talk about how many submarines are on patrol at any given time to the best of your ability, of course.
The Ohio-class submarines that we have now that were built during the Reagan administration are armed with the Trident missile. This is a sub-launch ballistic missile. It's not an intercontinental ballistic missile. It's an intermediate range ballistic missile. The Trident can't reach Russia from its port. It can't launch from port, and we don't even have command and control arrangements at our port facilities to launch those missiles because they don't have the range. They have to go to the mid-Atlantic or mid-Pacific to their patrol areas to be able to reach Russia. Most of our submarines are not at sea. It used to be during the height of the Cold War that about half of them would be at port and then about half of them at sea. But because the Trident has become so aged, we've reduced the operational tempo of the Trident ballistic missile submarines so that only about a third of them are at sea at any time. We have a fleet of about 14 Trident Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. Most of them are at port. We only have about 4 of them at sea at any time, 2 in the Atlantic and 2 in the Pacific. So they're basically, all those submarines are sitting ducks. The ballistic missile submarines at port would be destroyed in a surprise attack. Our strategic bombers that take 3 days to mobilize would be destroyed in a surprise attack. If they could beat us to the draw, they can destroy our ICBMs in their silos. One of the purposes of an EMP attack would be to paralyze our command and control system so that we would not be able to rapidly launch our silo-based ICBMs. And that would give the Russians the opportunity, the capability to destroy those ICBMs, the Minuteman, in their silos. And it would also get a system kill of our ballistic missile submarines that are on patrol at sea. Because our ballistic missile submarines do not carry unlocking codes. They have to get an emergency action message from the president, which includes unlocking codes, so that we could then unlock the weapons and the missiles so they could be fired. If you fail to get the emergency action message, the submarines are useless. And that is another reason for doing the EMP attack, because it will destroy the command and control arrangements that are necessary to utilize the submarines on patrol at sea. This is not the case with the Russians, and I was trying to contrast this in my earlier talk because the Russians do have ICBMs on their submarines. They have a range to reach the United States right from port. This is because they're such big believers in surprise attack. If we launch a surprise attack, not only can they launch their ICBMs, but they're going to launch those ICBMs at port. And if they want to launch a surprise attack, they can do it with their ICBMs, with their ballistic missile submarines at port, and with the ballistic missile submarines at sea, because they have these undersea cables where they can hook in to get emergency action messages secretly. So that's a huge difference between our strategic posture and theirs. As I said at the beginning, our strategic posture and the Russian strategic posture is as different as night and day. Our strategic forces are designed for transparency and for deterrence, and what's called crisis stability, so that the other side doesn't start getting suspicious that we're going to make a surprise attack against them in the middle of a crisis like the Ukraine war. The Russian strategic posture is designed for fighting a war, for winning a war, and to do so by achieving a surprise attack. That's why they have put most of their eggs, almost all their nuclear weapons, on intercontinental ballistic missiles, both in silos, mobile ICBMs, and their sea-based deterrent, things that can be launched in a few minutes with very little warning.
And what about aircraft carriers? Do they have any capability to project nuclear?
They used to. We used to have tactical nuclear weapons on our aircraft carriers and on our attack submarines. Not the ballistic missile submarines, but the attack submarines. They would have slickums on them, sub-launch cruise missiles that would have tactical nuclear warheads. But we took all of that away during the Cold War. In fact, the United States unilaterally dismantled, under the Presidential Nuclear Initiative, President Bush, the first President Bush, arrived at an agreement with President Yeltsin, that we were going to get rid of tactical nuclear weapons. Both sides were supposed to dismantle their tactical nuclear weapons. This was during the last year of the Bush administration. And we did. We got rid of almost all of our tactical nuclear weapons, including those that were deployed on aircraft carriers and submarines. Today, we only have about 180 tactical nuclear weapons left. We stopped dismantling them when the State Department finally admitted that the Russians were cheating on the Presidential Nuclear Initiative. They did not follow our example, and they did dismantle about 75% of their tactical nuclear weapons, maybe. We can't independently verify that. Right. But they themselves have said that they've dismantled 75%. But that still leaves them potentially with at least 2,000. We know they have at least 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons versus fewer than 200 for us. And they may have as many as 8,000 tactical nuclear weapons. And most of their tactical nuclear weapons are new generation nuclear weapons, designed to produce no radioactive fallout, designed for very low yields, or selectable yields, so you could do anything from blowing up a bridge to blasting a whole, division of tanks with that same weapon. For special effects like EMP effects on the battlefield, EMP effects for anti-aircraft purposes, X-rays for anti-missile purposes. We don't have anything like that in our inventory. They even probably have air-to-air nuclear missiles, to compensate for our advantage, our technological advantages in our aircraft, nuclear artillery. I wouldn't be surprised if their tanks have got nuclear rounds in them so that they can win a tank battle. One tank could win a tank battle, perhaps against a whole company of our best tanks. They are prepared to fight and win a nuclear war at every level, on the battlefield, in Europe, or strategically between the homelands.
And maybe just in closing, because I know you have to go, but what do you think is the likelihood of, true likelihood of something like this occurring? I know the U.S. right now at least is looking at upgrading their nuclear defense system. I heard a figure of $634 billion over the next 10 years, and I don't know how, if that's credible or if that's something which has been passed yet in Congress, but what do you think the likelihood is where we're at now with what's going on in Eastern Europe of an actual, if you were to put it at a percentage, of nuclear weapons being used? And I know it's totally arbitrary, but, just to give our viewers a sense of, because we're all about preparedness here and trying to prepare for these events. And I live in Saskatchewan, which is right above the, North Dakota, Montana, that whole place where they got the ICBMs. So, a lot of people want to know, what is the real threat of this at this point in time?
Well, we are investing. That's not an unrealistic figure, but what it's going to buy us is new submarines, new ICBMs, and new bombers in the 2030s. Okay, we're 10 years away from getting any of those systems. We're really far behind, and it's not going to get us new weapons. We're still going to be stuck with the same old weapons. We need to do a lot more than that. And I know it's going to be a big bill, but if we were keeping pace with the Russians and the Chinese all along, it wouldn't be such a big bill. We've been on a nuclear deterrence holiday for 30 years. So what can one expect at the end of the day? It's obviously going to be a big bill to catch up. That's why I I don't even know if we can catch up. We're so far behind in the technologies and the modernity of the systems. That's why I think we need to give a real high priority to strategic defensive systems, harden on our grids, hardening against both cyber and EMP, and deploying space-based missile defenses so that we can technologically leapfrog past this and change the nature of the competition. You know, what is the likelihood of this happening? You know, such things are always impossible to answer. You know, I mean, it would just be a guess. We are certainly at an elevated risk. I think the danger of a nuclear conflict, both long, whether it starts and the escalatory possibilities, I think our situation today is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have never before put ourselves in a situation where the adversary has declared the mobilization of his forces and is postured for surprise attack while we just do nothing. You know, Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis raised the DEFCON level of our nuclear deterrent almost as high as he could without actually getting in a nuclear war. He actually went to DEFCON 2, which is just short of actually getting into nuclear war. And as a consequence, he was able to de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis and prevail in that crisis. This is the first time we've ever faced, you know, a real possibility of a surprise nuclear attack, but we've left our forces at DEFCON 5, you know, and I think Biden has done that for political reasons because he doesn't want to admit that we're in a nuclear crisis, but it leaves our forces vulnerable. The submarines are not at sea. The bombers are not being mobilized. The ICBMs are at their normal everyday readiness. The crucial command and control assets, which are particularly the TACOM aircraft, all of them are at Tinker Air Force Base, almost all of them except for two. On a normal situation, we keep one on the Atlantic coast and one on the Pacific coast. But all of them, almost all of them, are just sitting ducks sitting there at Tinker. They should have been dispersed, but they haven't been. So the opportunity for our adversary is very good if he wanted to do it now. And the geostrategic situation that we are facing right now, for years and years, everyone has agreed, you know, that a scenario that is most likely to result in a nuclear war is exactly the one we're looking at now, where the two superpowers become engaged in a big war in Europe. And that's what's happened. You know, that's your most important indicator. So, you know, I think I can't put a percentage on it, you know, but even a small increase in the possibility of an existential threat should be unacceptable to us, you know, because the consequences are doom, you know, and I think there's been at least an increase by a small percentage. I think personally, I think it's much bigger than that. I think we're very close to the edge, and let's hope that the critics are not right, that Putin has gone crazy, that he's facing an internal revolt by his own elites. People are sort of celebrating that and cheering that on. I can't think of an even more dangerous situation than a major war in Europe where the two superpowers are involved and one side is crazy. I mean, that's not, you can't put a happy face on that scenario when it comes to the prospects of nuclear war.
Yeah, and I just want to conclude in saying that, you know, I've had a lot of people comment on the channel about how, well, you know, we have secret weapons and, you know, this exceptionalist view that I think for a lot of people is an idea they hold on to comfort themselves, that we, you know, we might not be sharing our plans, but, you know, we have a plan, don't worry, you know. But to me, you know, that's a very convenient thing for us to believe. But, you know, what if
denial behavior? Psychiatrists call it denial behavior. You know, people who don't want to face up to reality. We're a very open society. It's very hard for us to keep secrets. You know, I wish it were true, you know, that we had secret weapons that were stored away, you know, and all of this, and our vulnerability is not a fact. I had described Russian strategic culture as one of dysfunctional paranoia. Okay. Our strategic culture, I describe as dysfunctional optimism, you know, and that's exactly the kind of thing that you get from our strategic culture. We don't want to face up to the hard, scary facts. We would prefer to see the bright side. If there's any way of seeing a bright side, we look at that side. Oh, the Russians are being beaten in Ukraine. They're winning. That's got to be the reality. It can't be that there's some other alternative theory that isn't as positive for our side. And if there isn't a positive reality for us to, or a positive possibility for us to look to, then we invent things. We'll actually invent scenarios that don't even exist. Like, oh, well, we've got a secret weapon that's going to change everything. And so we don't have to worry about that. I can go back to living the good life and having a good time and sleep well at night, you know, and this has gotten us into trouble in all of our wars too. Every one of these defeats that we've had since the end of World War II, including the beginning of World War II itself, has come out of a strategic culture of dysfunctional optimism, where we think, you know, if all conflicts can be negotiated away, and if they can't be negotiated away, you know, then we can get in there and our military primacy is always going to win, and we can reconstruct the victim society, the other side, share along our own image and to share our values. And I don't know how many times we have to lose a war, you know, to learn the lesson. We never seem to learn, and maybe it's impossible for us to learn. Maybe it's our hubris, you know, because it's the nature of our strategic culture, you know, which is rooted in this. But that's why we have specialists and experts who are supposed to worry about these things for us. Alas, we don't listen to them. There have been people telling us and warning us. The bomb designers, the missile designers, the Department of Defense has been warning for many years. You know, the deterrent is getting old. You know, it's almost at the point where it has no credibility at all anymore, and people have been ignoring them. In fact, the administration, this is the dysfunctional optimism is to the point of fantasy now. You know, because the people, the anti-nuclear activists, who are not a fringe group anymore. They are in the Biden administration. The Biden administration, an important part of their political base are anti-nuclear activists. There are important positions in the Biden administration that anti-nuclear activists have been appointed to. There are leading members of Congress in very important positions, like Adam Smith, who's in effect an anti-nuclear activist. He's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. After President Biden, he's the second most important man in America to decide whether we're going to modernize our nuclear deterrent and our conventional forces, because he controls the defense budget. And Adam Smith has been for banning our ICBMs, getting rid of our strategic bombers, and cutting the ballistic missile submarine fleet in half, because he believes in minimum deterrence and mutual assured destruction, and nuclear weapons are unusable, and you can't win a nuclear war. So all we need is the bare minimum, and we'll be okay. And these people haven't given up on that. Even in the situation that we're going through now, the Biden administration has been holding off on the nuclear posture review, which could make all of this come true. All of these bad things could come true on Biden's nuclear posture review. They haven't changed their minds, despite the fact of this being on the edge of a nuclear conflict with Russia over Ukraine. So this is another example of denial behavior and what a strategic culture of dysfunctional optimists will do.
Yeah, I agree. And it would appear to me that if you had something like that, you would want to put it out there that you had it as a deterrence, you know, because that would be in line with our deterrence strategy thus far.
Yeah, what's the point of it if you don't have it? Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, anyways, it's been great having you on today, and I appreciate you coming on, sharing your expertise. I hope that you would come back and join us again. I'm going to, we're going to put this out there for the community. And if they have questions, we will compile some more questions for you. And as this whole thing progresses, I'm sure, your insights are bound to change and evolve as well. So thanks a lot for coming out.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to returning.
Awesome.
Thank you again.
You take care.
The best way to support this channel is to support.
Yeah, great interview. I love listening to people who are thoughtful and knowledgeable. I just love it. I always hope some of it'll rub off, it's just, it's, like I say, garbage in, garbage out. So the alternative to that is to put good information in your head. That way your perceptions are accurate and they're not flawed. There's nothing better than truth and real knowledge, real understanding. It gives you peace of mind. It gives you a sense of place and security in knowing things. It really does. There's nothing worse than ignorance and uncertainty. Then you've got nothing but vulnerability in that position. So, like I say, I'm so glad that this is available. This type of information, this type of insight into these things, because, you know, needless to say, I'm no nuclear expert. I'm no geopolitical strategist, think tanker kind of guy. I'm just your typical American trying to understand the world, and it's very, very valuable to find good information in this sea of bad information, propaganda, disinformation. There's a lot of garbage out there that doesn't help you, doesn't help me. And, you know, I think separating the bad stuff from the good stuff, that's kind of it's almost a spiritual battle. You know, you have to rely on your intuition oftentimes. Have a good week. Hope the storms aren't too bad Tuesday. Thank you so much for listening. Revolution.radio, that's where you can find us. That's where you can support us.